If you live on a fairly windy site, there are things that you can do to make your growing conditions better. I'm Zorab, and this is a very windy Byther Farm. So in our previous home, I used a series of windbreaks and different types of hedging and fencing to create a series of rooms. And if you look at it from above, you can see some very distinct areas mapped out. And that not only created wind barriers and windbreaks, but it also created a sort of feeling of coziness and intimacy within each area. So I never really felt like I was in this enormous open expanse, even though that area of our garden was in the region of half an acre. And here in West Wales, we live on the edge of a wind farm. And I think I should have realised when I saw the windmills for the wind farm all around us that we were probably on a fairly blustery site. And so on this site, I'm aiming to do exactly the same thing again. Create several small areas that feel cosy and comforting, but at the same time are reducing the amount of wind flow that's coming across the site and buffeting not only me, but the plants. One of the easiest ways to reduce the impact of the wind is to put in, wind breaks, whether it's in the form of fencing or hedging or windbreak netting. And so here in the middle of our site, the wind usually, and I'm going to say usually, most of the year the wind comes from that direction across. Right at the moment it's coming from there, so I actually need the windbreak to work in both directions. Along this fence, which was already here when we moved in, we've put stock-proof netting so that we could have stock in either side if we wanted to. And then as time went on and we realised that there were quite so many rabbits here, I put in some rabbit-proof netting as well, which is very fine, but it will still help slow down the wind a little bit. And then along this edge here, I have planted a hedge. Now every now and then there is a tall tree like this. So there are a series of plums and gauges along here. And in between them, I've planted currants, red currants, white currants, black currants. And in fact, I think there are some joster berries and also some chuckleberries, but they're all the currant family. And these are going to take a bit of time to develop into a hedge. So in the meantime, I have to cope with the wind, but that's okay. I know this hedge is coming. And every spring, if it looks like there are gaps in the hedge, I will add in some extra currant plants that I've propagated from mixed native hedging to a woven living fence. All the different layers add texture so they make it more interesting, but it's also better for the wildlife because there's a whole range of habitats. And again, along this boundary, I've put in another hedge, and this is a mixed native hedging. And I've put this in as a wildlife corridor so that wildlife can travel from the woods over there, along here to the woods in that direction. So although these plants at the moment look very small, it won't take too long for them to develop into a really good hedge. In our previous home, they looked like this for about a year or so. Year 3, they got to this height. Year 4, they were mostly taller than me. And by year 5, it was a really mature and busy, full of wildlife hedge. I won't let this hedge get too tall because it will cast a shadow downhill. That's south, so for most of the day the shadow will go in that direction, and I don't want it to stop things in these beds from growing. In some places there'll be a more obvious continuous hedge, and in other places like this I've got some trees and some shrubs in a block here and then repeated up there with a space in the middle, so that as I'm walking along I can see through and see that there are other trees and there's more garden beyond it. But let's be realistic, most of us don't have an enormous garden. So what do we do then? It's got just fencing around 3 sides of the garden, and the house wall is on the other side, and it's a fairly solid fence. If you're allowed to increase the height of the fence, put some trellis around the top of it, which will, as the wind comes up, will slow it down, but don't stop it buffeting so much. Or put in a couple of taller trees. Now these don't have to be hugely wide trees. You can get tall columnar trees, which will still be attractive, won't block out too much light of your garden, but will also add the gentle windbreak above the fence line, just to slow that wind down a little bit. In Monmouthshire, one of the key lessons I learnt was that sometimes just one plan of action to combat wind is not enough, and you need several tactics to deal with it if you're on a very windy site. So that's the hedge I was just talking about with the red currants and the plums in it. And over here there's been a rose hedge put in, and that's Rosa rugosa. It will have lovely hips for making rose hip wine or rose hip syrup or jelly at a later date. But in the meantime, it's another layer of windbreak. It's another way of slowing down the wind as it moves across the land, whichever direction it's going in. A very solid structure like a shed, or in this case a field shelter, will give you a really good windbreak, except it's not good really. So what happens if this is the side of your building is the wind comes along and gushes up and over it, and as it goes over the other side it kind of comes down in a big swirl. But what would be better would be for the wind to come to a barrier and move through it, so that you've got a slightly open structure, and it will slow the wind down as it goes along, rather than going up over the top and causing more turbulence on the other side of it. Now, standing here at the moment, I'm really enjoying the wind not hitting me on the back of the head. But where the camera is, and just beyond that, I can see the trees moving really quite rapidly. And that's where the wind is coming over the top and coming down and swirling around. And here in the veg garden, I'm doing other things like increasing the height of the sides of the raised beds. The reason for that is twofold. It means that I could fill the beds up more deeply to grow more deeply rooted veg, or in the case of this bed, which will have yet another layer around the outside of it, I'm doing it so that the sides of the bed actually act as a bit of protection and reduce the amount of wind that's coming across the very young plants that are growing in the beds. One of the practical things that I try and do when I'm planting trees is to plant them at an angle. So all the trees in the orchard are planted leaning into the prevailing winds. So not the winds that we've had over the last few days, but the wind that we have most of the year round. So they're planted that way, which means over time the wind will push them more upright. And I got this idea having driven around and seen so many hedgerows where the trees are really bending over from the wind, and I just thought, if I plant facing the wind, as time goes on, the wind, rather than pushing the trees over, is going to push them upright. So that's my thinking behind this. Only time will tell. I did this in our last house and it did seem to work quite well. Right across this garden there are rows of trees and shrubs. All the time they're creating extra barriers, extra layers of hedging, extra layers of windbreaks. So for example, this one here is black currants, honeyberry and a magnolia. And then 4 or 5 metres further on, I'm planning to put in some evergreen trees along here, but not ones that are going to form a thick fence. They'll be spaced, so you will still be able to see through them, and the air will be able to flow through, as will the light and the view. And that conifer hedging is going to be made up of juniper skyrocket, which is, as the name suggests, it's a tall, thin plant. And at the moment, they're this tall. So it's going to take a few years for them to get to a really decent height. But the sooner I get them in, the sooner we're going to start seeing some results.